Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. I'm afraid I heard the surgeon apologizing this morning for not being very scientific. I'm afraid I'll have to apologize as well for not being very conventional, but I'll try not to rock the boat too hard. I have no conflicts of interest to declare, and this is my strictly personal opinion. Payers, and I am representing the payer point of view here, are facing challenging times, and we are also facing interesting times. And I hear many times that it doesn't look like it, or it doesn't sound like it, but actually it's an interesting field, especially for the moment. There are some challenges coming up. There are some challenges present as well, and I try to give you an overview on what I personally perceive as challenges we are facing at the moment, and which will increase in the upcoming years. The first challenge is this slide on the world population. This talk gave me the opportunity to look into all of this, and it's amazing to see how quickly the world population is growing. We were, until 1800, we weren't even 1 billion inhabitants, and around the time I was born, we were half the population we are right now, and I won't go into details on this date, but we can expect that even when the growth rate is declining, that within 200 years the world population will have doubled again. So I think this is one major challenge we are facing. The second challenge is the aging of the population, and this slide shows you the increase in the mean age and the increase in the number of patients or number of people aged 60 years and older. And it's also by development region, and there's also some forecasts until 2050, and there you can see that there will be a significant increase. There will still be a significant increase in the aging of the world population, and this increase will be the highest in the less developed regions, as the increase is already almost to a maximum in the better developed countries, as you can see in the darker figures. This is very important as well, because it's pervasive and it's unprecedented. As we know, the last century there has been an enormous increase in aging, but this will be even stronger in the century following. And we all know that cancer is, the incidence of cancer is higher in the older population, so the incidence of cancer is strongly related to this figure. This is another slide I added to show you two different things. It says, it was an article in The Guardian only 3 days ago warning that the medicine supply for Greece will or faces to be stopped or slowed down significantly when or if Greece would leave the Eurozone. And this was an article, a warning by EFPIA, the European Pharma Association. And the second figure shows the increasing number of asylum seekers coming into Europe. And why do I show these slides? Well, actually for two different reasons. The first is because I believe the financial crisis, and I'm not the only one believing so, that the financial crisis in Europe is not solved so far, and this is important if we look at reimbursement of medicines a little bit further. A second thing, and this is maybe even more important, is I think that these two problems show very clearly that Europe is not acting as a union so far, and I think that will not help us in the future when we talk about reimbursement of expensive medicines. We really need Europe to be acting more as a group and not as individual countries. But these problems show that we are far from that. And the financial crisis is not a good thing for health, as this article showed, this recent Lancet article showed, and it focused on 3 different countries, Greece, Spain and Portugal, and it said very clearly, and it compared to Iceland, where they succeeded more or less to overcome the problems, whereas in Greece, Spain and Portugal, big problems are to be expected. And I think we all know that Greece, without any doubt, is the worst, but even there, if we will continue to act as a Europe, it's our problem as well. Another challenge is the increasing number of cancer patients. There's different predictions on that. Some predictions say that by 2030 there will be 27 new cancer patients per year in the world. There is a decrease, as you can see, in colorectal cancer, which is the blue line, but there's slight increases in, for example, skin cancer, thyroid cancer, and liver cancer. And as the population is growing significantly and also getting older, the overall absolute number of cancer patients will significantly increase in the upcoming years, and so we will have to treat them. The overall number is going to increase, but more than that, the patients will also live longer. Globally or basically in around the 80s, in 1990, excuse me, the overall, the 5-year survival was expected to be only about 50%, and now it's already 2/3 of the patients who will survive the first 5 years. So there is a significant increase in survival of cancer patients. Of course, this is completely the result of the innovative, more or less innovative medicines that have been developed, but since there will be more patients and they will live longer, the financial burden will increase. And it's maybe a bit perverse to show this slide afterwards, but I think it's important to show the financial burden of cancer patients. There is the impact of new cancer cases, and it was calculated for 2009, saying that the cost in 2009 for the new cancer patients was about $280 billion US. And if you look at the overall economic burden of cancer in 2009, it was like $900 billion. This will only increase, of course, when we develop medicines resulting in a longer survival for cancer patients. So we will have to pay for the medicines first, and then we will have to pay for the patients as well. What about the pipeline? There's more recent slides on this as well, but it's just, this is a nice slide because it also shows a regression of the past years, and there you can see very clearly that the pipeline is still looking very promising, and that without any doubt cancer is the most important therapeutic field in this pipeline. Cancer, which is of course also salami sliced, as they say, into more and more different orphan indications. Why is this important? Because the evidence brought for these orphan indications and also the prices the evidence can be less and the prices can be significantly higher. But these differences haven't been made in this slide, but it's a side effect also of this growth. So, Forbes in 2014, Paul Howard stated that sure, in the end we will be able to beat cancer, but the question is, will we be able to afford it? And to answer this question, I think it might be interesting for you to highlight the differences between the licensing and the reimbursement decision. I've heard some talks presenting new molecules and new clinical trials, which is very much what the licensing procedure is about, and I think it's interesting to tell you something about the reimbursement decision. So, if you look at the evaluation, what we are looking at the licensing agencies, and it's FDA, EMA, the most important ones. There are 3 main parameters that they are looking at. I think you all know them: quality, safety, and efficacy. And then it's the benefit-risk balance, so the the safety against efficacy, which is the most important parameter. For the reimbursement, it's a completely different and it's a broader decision. First of all, there's no FDA or EMA organization. If we look at the European situation, it's completely up to the member states. And why is this so? It's what the EU treaty says on the subsidiarity principle, so each member state can decide for itself whether or not a medicinal product has to be reimbursed. This is already a very big difference, and this is also why I showed a few slides ago why it frightens me that Europe is not acting as a union, and even less, I believe. The evaluation should be based, the quality, safety, efficacy evaluation is not redone at the reimbursement level, but some additional parameters are looked at, such as the therapeutic need, the effectiveness, and I will come back to this, and of course, last but not least, the price. And if we look at all these additional parameters, we end up looking at a relative therapeutic value, and there we compare to alternatives, which is something that is not very much done at the registration level. So looking at what's already available for certain therapeutic areas. We look at the economic value, how much is it worth, and last but not least, we look at the budget impact. And this is, for example, in the Hep C domain, an interesting additional factor, and I will also come back to this. If you look at the objectives, the why of the licensing versus the reimbursement objective, well, it's not up to me to decide on these objectives. So I looked at the mission statements of FDA and EMA, and I was quite surprised actually to find in both mission statements, of course, not only that they want to protect public health, for example, by assuring safety, efficacy of medicines and also of veterinary drugs, which is the same for FDA and EMA, but also, and this is what struck me, that they stress that they also feel responsible for advancing public health by helping to speed innovations. And I find something similar actually on the EMA website. And then the question is, how do they try to do so? Because they can approve on the registration of them, but then that's not enough to bring them to the patients. Another interesting aspect of these mission statements is the definition of public health. What's public health? Is it just approving on registrations, or is it also making sure that patients will get the products in the end? And there's no clarification on this definition either. As for the reimbursement statements or mission statements, there were no clear mission statements actually. And why? Because they are completely different and heterogeneous, and it very much depends on the different member states. And of course, it's also depending on social, economical, political. If I look at the Belgian situation, it's very much depending on the political situation, what the priorities in the reimbursement system are. If this is a good thing or a bad thing, I will not talk about this now, but it's very political dependent. It's also very ethically sensitive debate, which is far less the case for the registration decision. It was interesting for me actually to look at the EMA website, looking up this mission statement, because a little bit further on the same EMA webpage, I found some clarification on what EMA does not do. And they put this very clearly on their website, saying that what we do not do, there were amongst other things, 3 things that struck me. The first one was they said we do not influence the price or the availability of medicines. The price maybe is understandable, availability is already a bit more difficult to my opinion. So what I showed earlier, what's happening in Greece, EMA is not at all involved and clearly states that it doesn't want to be involved in this. Second thing is the development of guidelines, and then we come to the comparison, for example, to alternative treatments, where EMA says we are not involved in developing guidelines. In other words, we do not look at therapeutic alternatives as far as they are not subject of the registration clinical trials. And last but not least, we do not establish ethical codes. We are not involved in this, is what EMA says. What's interesting about this statement is that if EMA doesn't do it, somebody else has to do it. And I think in practice, this will very often be the reimbursement commissions. What reimbursement commissions are not responsible for, of course, is the marketing, and then marketing in the most broad sense of the word. There's also some misunderstanding about this sometimes, because we are sometimes reproached not bringing drugs to the market, but it's impossible for reimbursement commissions to do so when there is no registration. So the decision, the basis of the decision, the final decision, is quite different actually between the licensing and the reimbursement procedure. First of all, for the licensing, the common denominator, there is a common denominator which is already very helpful, and it is ICH GCP. And the data resulting from the clinical trials, the phase 1 to 3 clinical trials, brought to these agencies. And this common denominator does not exist for the reimbursement committees, where the data can be completely different, and the quality of this data can be far more questionable. There's also more hypotheses in the reimbursement decisions, such as how many patients will have to be treated with this drug, for example. A second basis for the decision in licensing is the scientific values. The licensing decision is, we can say, strictly scientific. There's no ethical, there could be ethical issues, but they have to be or should have been tackled by ethical committees at the time of the clinical trial approval, whereas these ethical aspects are far more present in the reimbursement procedure, so are the societal and the social values. A third thing is the target population. When licensing or registration of a new drug is considered, the agencies will look into the target population that was included in the clinical trials. And we all know, and it has been said here before as well, that this population is completely different after registration, because the population will broaden up, as it has already, a broadening is already allowed by the label, because the official label will be bigger or larger than the inclusion criteria, and then there will also be some off-label use. And last but not least, the difference in the market access, the licensing can lead to a hypothetical or theoretical market access, but it won't result in patient access unless there is reimbursement. As for the evidence, I think it's interesting to show this slide, which I think it's a very good article that appeared in Nature Drug Discovery only a few years ago, showing that since the variability, and we all know that variability in clinical trials is kept as low as possible, especially when it's getting harder and harder to show any potential benefit, then and the target, the in and exclusion criteria focus very much on patients where they expect the highest possible benefit and the lowest, the best tolerators. Whenever a drug would be approved at the registration level and it will get an official label, then the official registration indications will be a bit broader and less constraining than the inclusion criteria of this study. And then you can see immediately that the benefit risk is already decreasing. And as the benefits will decrease a little bit, variability will go up and also the risks will increase. And then after a positive reimbursement decision, very often, or when a drug comes to the market, which is very often after reimbursement, then there's also this outside label scenario, and I know we all do it and everyone does it, and I understand as well, but the impact on the benefit risk and on the benefits can be huge. And it's something that is very unpredictable and difficult to predict at the time of reimbursement. The question is, this is called the efficacy-effectiveness gap, where effectiveness reflects the efficacy in what's called real life. The question is, when there would be a shift like that, resulting in, after all, a very negative benefit risk, whether or not reimbursement authorities should stop the reimbursement of such a medicinal product. Another problem is to prove that the benefit risk decreased. So because the data to prove this will be less correct and less precise than the data at the moment of the registration, because you won't have the randomized phase 3 trials to show this. So, as for the launches, expected launches, as I showed you, the pipeline is quite filled. We know that even with a full pipeline, there will be some negative, many of them will result in negative outcomes, but still taking into account these negative outcomes, we can still expect that launches, or the overall net number of launches will increase. I like this article because it's a group in Utrecht, the Netherlands, together with people from the European Medicines Agency, who tried to objectify the way non-approval process is taking place. So they looked at registration from 3 following years, and the total number of medicines they looked at was 68. And they looked at the negative decisions, so those that didn't come to the market, and they tried to objectify, of course in a rather artificial way, to objectify why these drugs didn't get to the market. So what was the reason for not marketing these drugs? And then the 3 groups of parameters they created were first the development plan, so the level of innovativeness, if you want to say. The second was the clinical outcome, and this was based on efficacy and safety data. And the third one was the clinical relevance related to alternatives. And they showed that negative clinical outcomes, so a not so good safety profile or a not so good efficacy profile, resulted most often, fortunately, in a negative decision. On the other hand, they showed as well that a negative clinical relevance led least of all cases to a non-approval decision. And this demonstrates, or this highlights that it's a matter that reimbursement commissions have to look at, because whether or not the drug is relevant is not an issue that registration committees look at. And here's a study from the University of Birmingham showing the degree of innovativeness of clinical trials, also based on different parameters, of course, like the targeting and the way of working, but also other parameters. And they looked at launches between 2001 and 2012, and they concluded that only a quarter of these launches could be considered as highly innovative. And what's also interesting is that they said that more than half of the launches in this period were considered only slightly innovative. And they said that this trend, or they showed that this trend was increasing over this period of 12 years. So if there's one thing pharma companies will never argue about, then it is this statement published in BMG more than 10 years ago already, saying that for the registration is one thing, they have to pass the quality, safety, efficacy hurdles, but then the last and the most important one is to get reimbursed, because with the current prices, without reimbursement, there is no access to the market. And so to reimburse, we need some money, and the question is how much do we have and how much can we spend on this? This is data I found from IMS on drug spendings. This is a slide showing the oncology, only in the oncology field, the cost spent per capita on oncology drugs, and it compared the year 2010 with the year 2014. And it said that it shows that in absolute numbers, the spendings on oncology drugs is the highest in the US, where it increased from $70 to $100. So there was an increase of about 40%. The highest increase over this period of time was in the UK, where there was an increase of 60% on these spendings. And what's also interesting, as we are in Spain for the moment, and as was also shown in the slide earlier on financial crisis, in Spain there was a zero increase in this budget, which is frightening, I think. Another slide here is to show the relative spendings in oncology drugs compared to the overall drug budget, and then you see that in a relative figures, Europe spends more on oncology than the US. So in absolute, it's the US, but relative to the whole drug budget, it's Europe. And also there you see a clear increase. So with these prices and these increases, I think we all realize that it seems unsustainable for the future, and there is increasing awareness on this. There was already awareness a few years ago with certainly the biologicals caused this decision. Cetuximab you all know, but I didn't show it in a GI indication. This is also, aflibercept is also a drug I think you all heard about, and an article that launched a lot of debate, let's say. And there's also Hep C, for example, which is a very interesting case and which resuscitated the debate very much because the cost is extremely high, but on the other hand, efficacy is also very straightforward and clear. So they say it's clinical marvel, but a financial failure, and well, there's some food for thought there. And sofosbuvir is really the drug. When you look in the PubMed, for example, there's a huge amount of efficacy and economic studies on this drug. And the conclusions are always almost the same, saying that on a per patient basis, the cost effectiveness is fine and very acceptable. But the problem is that if you look at the total number of patients, and so now we come back to the budget impact, the overall budget impact, it's more frightening. And the question is if we will have enough money left for something else, of course. So what can we do? I don't want to be pessimistic all over. So I think there's some easy things we can do and try to tackle some of the issues we are facing. First of all, I think we really need to add some endpoints in registration trials. An easy example is the quality of life, especially when the primary endpoint is progression-free survival. If we have no data on quality of life, and this really happens very often, then it's very hard to take reimbursement decisions. The second is a suggestion from a colleague of Leuven very recently to do more biomarker research also on these registration trials. With good biomarker research you can define subgroups, and with subgroups you can limit the overall number of reimbursement, and it's also medically perfectly acceptable because you target on those patients who will benefit. I think we need to fine-tune standard of care. It's a very flu definition, and that's okay, but I think there is some work in fine-tuning this definition, and for that we need head-to-head trials. If we look, for example, in the melanoma field or in the renal cancer field, there has been so many new molecules. Most of them were developed at the same time, and we have no head-to-head information. From a reimbursement point of view, it's very, very difficult to make decisions if you don't have any of these data. We need registries, and I heard this saying this morning as well. I fully agree with that. We need good registries, though. And we also need trials that challenge doses, regimens, durations. We shouldn't always just accept what was brought to us by pharmaceutical companies. We can also challenge these information. I like this article because it was already in my conclusions a few years ago that I think we need more academic head-to-head trials, and then very recently this article was published saying that when head-to-head studies are sponsored by pharmaceutical industry, they are almost always in favor of the company sponsoring the study. And I think it's not to say something negative about companies, it's just to stress that sometimes we really need some independent research, and I think university hospitals should really invest on that. We need guidelines. I think guidelines should be based on academic research as well. The only input cannot come from industry. I think it should be a good mixture of both. The biosimilars, for example, are a nice example why we need international guidelines. Everyone's afraid of biosimilars, and that's understandable, but the same was true for generics a few years ago, a few decennia ago, and now everyone accepts. So maybe we should just talk about it in a more international podium. I think I told you that I find it important that they are as independent as possible, and I think we should include payers. Of course, I'm talking for myself, and patients as well. We also should involve prescribers much more, and I think companies should involve prescribers much more as well, not only afterwards when they want to make reimbursement proposals, but earlier as well to define, for example, real medical need. What is the real medical need that their prescribers are needed as well? To define target populations, and last but not least, to define stopping rules. Sometimes we should stop prescribing certain drugs because they are too expensive. And then there's a philosophical debate. What values are we willing to pay? We cannot continue to pay everything for everyone, and what price, and will we continue to pay progression-free survival if we have no data on quality of life, for example? Another question is, should we hold on to the equity principle? Thinking about Greece, for example, should we? Can we? Do we think it's important? Personally, I do think it's important, but then efforts should be made. And what do patients value? Should we really give them a seventh-line treatment if they really don't want it, actually? And how much can we pay for that? So we should involve them in the debate. So we have a very promising looking pipeline, but the prices are increasing dramatically as well. So we won't have enough with statistical values. We would also need to involve payers. And I think we should start looking for the real unmet medical need and have some societal point of view on that. And I would like to conclude with a quote of my favorite writer, Ian McEwan, saying that the core of humanity is to try and imagine to be someone else than yourself. Thank you.